Thanks for coming.
We do, it's in my calendar.
Except in the line on the last slide related to what we talked about.
Okay.
Great. I'm happy to introduce Kai Larsen. Kai is a faculty member in the lead school. We don't often get people from lead school over here, so it's nice to have you here.
Sorry to do that.
No, it's our fault, I'm sure. Where he's in information science and in organizational leadership, I guess, in information analytics. That's an interesting part of our organization. He's involved in all sorts of interesting activities, which I hear about in terms of getting data together in new and interesting ways. That's what he's going to talk about today. The title of his talk is Understanding Behavioral Constructs Toward Theoretical and Disciplinary Integration. So you'll parse that for us now.
I hope so too.
Hey, great. Thanks a lot, Kai.
Thank you, Myron. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a great honor for me to be here. I should thank that there's a few sponsors that have been helpful to me. Primarily, I think initially, the CCTSI down in Denver, Translational Sciences group down there, and the National Science Foundation, and there's some small bit things from NIH, as well as, of course, CU. What I'm going to do today is give you a rundown on all my research activities, but with a particular focus on two projects that I think are perhaps a bit more interesting than most of them. This is how I see the world. The behavioral and social sciences, to me, tend to consist of theories. They're sort of supports for our thinking, and without them it gets hard to communicate information or to put information and our knowledge into boxes. Each theory tends to have any number of articles associated with them, testing that theory, extending the theory, and so on. And it's not unheard of for a given behavioral and social science theory to have 40 to 80,000 articles that cite that, which actually leads to some problems that we're dealing with in this area. And now each article will tend to have one-to-many constructs, that is these unobservables or variables or whatever you want to call them. It depends on the context of what you're looking at there, and I'll talk much more about that. My research splits up approximately like this. I tried to develop natural language processing approaches or algorithms that can figure out which constructs measure the same underlying latent construct in the brain without having to put those questions for those constructs into a survey and send it out to people. So I'm trying to shortcut that process. So think of it as factor analysis without, or principal components analysis without respondent data. I worked a lot with, Chi Hao here is a past PhD student that I co-advised with James Martin over in computer science, and this is a current PhD student. A very related research area here, which uses almost exactly the same machinery, is where we're trying to figure out to what extent can we actually use natural language processing, or for the most part, similarity algorithms to predict. Let's say you have two questions in a survey. My boss, the boss of my institute, is a fantastic man. And the boss for my institute is on top of all the problems that we face. If I put those two into a survey and I send it out to all the members of the institute, we're going to probably calculate a correlation between those two questions at some point. I'm trying to shortcut that process as well by figuring out what is that correlation going to be before you send it out. So that's another part of this. We're doing some small things, and Maren, I threw you in here. I've been working so hard on convincing Maren to work with me on this, so, and I heard him say yes at some point, so now he's there. We're trying to deal with the fact that these constructs and all of that There's about, I estimate, at least 2 million articles in the social and behavioral sciences that have these kinds of constructs in them. The range of calculations, depending on what assumptions I make, ranges between 2 and 10 million. What we think to get at these constructs in an effective manner, we have to actually come up with the tools to pull these articles apart and figure out what is the correlation in this paper, what are the constructs it's looking at, what are the hypotheses, what are the industries it's looking at, context, and so on. So in that sense, we have a revise and resubmit in the top journal in our field with Jingle, a past student of mine who's now an assistant professor at the University of Virginia and a colleague of hers. We just ran a National Science Foundation workshop up in Estes Park where we brought in both experts on behavioral science and on natural language processing and ontologies. And the hope is to be able to put together a pilot grant for this kind of infrastructure through IBS so that we can actually start collecting all this data on what's inside these articles. I'm doing a little bit of work on these theories, so we've developed some tools for tracking theories, these big theories that we've lost track of, essentially. And we have a system that pulls down all the articles that cite a set of articles that are theory initiating, if you like, and then uses machine learning to figure out which of these articles actually contribute to the theory as opposed to just citing it. So we're using a bunch of different features for that. I'd love to say that's going great, but we just got a third round review back this week. And it was what we in my field called a major revise and resubmit with 20 pages of comments from the reviewers. Including that one of the reviewers cannot understand why we would want to suggest sampling of past articles because there are now 80,000 of them. So why would you want to sample? So that's one of the concepts that we're trying to get through the lit review area there. Here's my wife and daughter who will not like it if they knew I was sharing morning selfies with you guys. They were trying to see who would look the most tired, I guess. I'm raising our daughter. My wife is a resident in surgery in another state. So morning for us on the left was actually probably the 26th hour of awakeness for her. I just finished the first draft of a book on automated machine learning, which was on Tuesday accepted for publishing by Oxford University Press, so that was exciting.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Other hobbies that I have is ontology and taxonomy development. Here's one that we just submitted to the Journal of Annals of Behavioral Medicine, which is actually a taxonomy of all the human behaviors across 9 different disciplines that articles care about, or that top journal articles care about. We're in the middle of a project where we're trying to organize all the research validities in the world. So we have found 350 or so research validities that we're trying to get a sense of. This is probably the hardest project I've ever engaged in because there's so many philosophical and related assumptions behind all of our validities, like here, conclusion validity or conceptual validity. So those are the things that make me happy. Today, I'll be focusing on constructs or the things that lead to, we think, or are related to behaviors. And as you may very well know, I would assume, behaviors are really the things that can change our lives in major ways. You know, the fact that you got up this morning is, well, maybe change your life for the better, one hopes, right? There's, you can waste your life by watching TV. You can extend your brain by reading. You can help the world by communicating better. You can exercise, which is great for you. You can go to regular checkups with your doctor. That's another behavior that we might care about in terms of research. You may go on to college, and that's of course a behavior that has thousands of sub-behaviors under it, right? So, and we think that there are positive effects of these behaviors. You may game, which has some positive effects I'm being told by my kids. Or you may decide to set the world record in how many kids you can kill in a day. This guy shot at the island I used to work at and killed 68 kids there, and shot at my sister while she was pulling kids out of the water. We can engage in social activism, which would certainly be a lot more positive. And the amount of work and our own time behavior that will actually make a big difference is pretty enormous. It's everything we do, simply put. Now, it turns out, from the behavioral and social sciences point of view, most of these behaviors are driven by a set of constructs. That's how we have conceptualized them. And those behaviors, those constructs, tend to be conceptualized very similarly across different disciplines and as predicting different behaviors. So, for example, take the theory of reasoned action, if you're familiar with that. It has been used to predict a number of behaviors, right? Or explain is probably a more apt word. So that's sort of where I'm driving at this research from, starting with all these behaviors, we're going backwards and trying to organize all the constructs that lead to them. And of course, you might argue that sleeping is not a behavior, but certainly finding a healthy place to sleep is a behavior. So this is what we're focusing on, what drives all of these behaviors. And it's clearly something in our heads. I think that's a pretty easy one to agree on. So we're focusing on perceptions, beliefs, emotions, attitudes, these things in our brains that are not directly observable. Constructs are specific instances of these things, perceptions, beliefs, emotions, and attitudes. And you will find all of these, you will find these in a number of behavioral and social science disciplines. And you may even recognize some of these from your own research as well. So some of these are from my discipline, some of them are from other disciplines. You might say self-efficacy. I've done research on self-efficacy. It's the most popular construct out there, it turns out. Do I believe that I'm capable of doing something? But it's also got hundreds, if not thousands, of different versions of it because it's applied to all kinds of different behaviors, right? So what we're trying to do in our project is to collect as many high-quality constructs as possible. We're funded by NSF to evaluate 10 different behavioral disciplines, ranging from behavioral medicine to business disciplines. And develop NLP and machine learning algorithms to integrate these and better understand how they relate to each other, especially across disciplines. I have to say I mostly failed on the cross disciplines because it's so much work just to integrate them within disciplines. So we've been focusing our initial work there, honestly. There's one aspect of this initially that's about construct identity. So take, for example, effort expectancy, complexity, and the ease of use of the technology. Turns out all to be the same thing, measured very similarly. It's just that researchers need to be novel to get published. So they will take an existing scale in some cases and rename it. I'm sure none of you have ever done that, but some people do that. The alternative setting is where you have a bunch of things named the same thing, which are actually related to different things in our brain, as I mentioned earlier. So we want to be able to detect that these things are the same or synonymous, you might say, even though a linguist might disagree with that, the use of that word, and whether they are actually different. It boils down to the simple question of, given two constructs, can we say, regardless of the name, can we say whether they're measuring the same thing or not? And can we say how correlated they would be at the end of the day if you survey based on them? The problem here goes all the way back to one of the founders of the psychometric discipline, Edward Thorndike, who coined this Jingle fallacy thing, which is part of this. And then Kelly in 1927 proposed the Jangle fallacy. And that's just, with these names, are they measuring the same thing or not? So we developed a bunch of, or applied a bunch of algorithms to answer that question. We used a pretty common one called Latent Semantic Analysis. We used LDA, or latent Dirichlet allocation. We used some wordnet approaches, which is basically a set of words that a bunch of experts or linguists have actually coded as being synonymous or not, and how they're related to each other in the taxonomy. And then we created some combinations here, especially this construct identity detector, or SID1. And here's my question for you. Who here knows what latent semantic analysis is? A few of you. You want me to do a quick run through on it with visualizations to understand what we're actually doing?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it. Do it. Okay. So this is actually something that several people on this campus who have since passed on, Tom Landauer among them, actually developed at Bell Labs in the late 80s. And that has been used for all kinds of text-related things, including to grade essays, okay? I'm going to try and take you through a quick example of how that works, okay? So take a set of documents, and I'm actually applying it to just the title of documents right here, 7 different titles of documents. The IT factor, IT and IS, a respecification of theory, and so on. 4 of these are from my discipline, information systems. And 2 of them are from the operations research area, so essentially applied math. And 1 is somewhere in the middle, okay? To do an LSA analysis of these, I'm going to simplify the problem and just focus on the commonly occurring words, or the important words. I generally don't do that in my research because it raises questions about what did I remove, which words did I remove, and why did you remove them. So I generally don't do this. But we're just going to focus on the bolded words here. Next step, create a documents as columns and words as rows matrix. And inside of each cell, count how many times a word appeared in its given document. Very straightforward. You might weigh that matrix to make sure that commonly occurring words would get a lower weight, and you might normalize it a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward math, and so I'm not going to do it in this case. I'm just going to keep it very simple, and I'm going to analyze the original matrix. So really all I'm doing is taking a best least squares fit to this matrix. That's all I'm doing with it. So I extract a set of eigenvectors, and you have to decide what dimensionality you want, how many dimensions you want to extract. It's an unsolved problem. Landauer et al. Said 300 seems to work, so everyone's sticking with 300 after that. We've evaluated it and found that once you hit 200, it gets really good, and then every dimension after that improves a tiny little bit. So we've gone up to 900 without finding that that stops. But at some point, you start including too many dimensions, and you include the noise of language. So you're taking a larger matrix and you're reducing it down, and that focuses on the core elements of the language. In this case, I'm just going to use 2 dimensions, because I have a tiny matrix. Once I do that, I end up with every document and every word having a location in my 2-dimensional space. Okay, so now I have a vector for each word and each document. I can now visualize that so you can get a better sense of where these documents and words are in this space, because it's 2-dimensional. So you'll notice here that the IS ones end up down here, and the operations ones are up here, and document 5 with sort of its weirdness in the middle ends up there. So that might seem like this is working really well, but it's actually working much better than it looks, because we don't generally measure these documents and words in terms of their Euclidean distances to each other. We generally measure them with a cosine measure, which is an angular measure. So you start with the origin, and if you wanted to measure how similar documents, say 2 and 4 are to each other, you can get a cosine of 0.97. Think of a cosine like a correlation. It goes from -1 to 1 and can be interpreted very similarly. In fact, the math is almost identical. Here's what's cool about it. It can actually measure 2 words and find that they're related to each other, even though they never appeared in the same document together. So it has really good synonymic features. And of course, here you can then measure documents. And if you were to measure the cosine between document 1 and document 6, you'd find that that would be very close to 0, because they're from different disciplines and don't have word overlap. What we're doing is we're creating these semantic spaces, and of course they're based on much larger sets of documents, and I'll show you what we did it with. But then we project in these survey questions into the semantic space, which is the red thing I just showed you. And when you do that, it's really just a matter of adding up the vectors for each word in that survey question. And right here, I get question 1 here, I get question 2 there, and I can now measure their cosine to each other and find that this is -0.17, suggesting that they're not very related to each other in this case. And you put those 2 into a survey, you will probably not get a very high correlation between them. Here's a quick example again on how we did this. So you have a construct 1 with 3 items, construct 3 with 3 items, and we actually do all combinations of items against all other items. But here's just an example of 2 constructs and how we calculate them against each other. So in this case, this item and this item are actually synonymous, if you like. They're measuring the ease of use of the technology. We start by calculating the cosine between every pair. Pretty straightforward so far. And then we find the highest cosine in this case between I3 and I2. And we bold those, basically keep that cosine, and remove every other relationship between those 2 items and any other item. And because now that's locked in as one of our pairs. We then go and look for the second highest cosine among the remaining ones, and in this case you'll see that's between item 1 and item 1 here, 0.98, and that leaves the final one, which now has no more potential relationships. I'm stuck with 3 pairs, sets of item pairs, and now I can then go ahead and estimate the similarity between the constructs themselves. In this case, I think I did an average of all of them, but we've tried a number of different things, like the second highest, or the average of the first two, and so on, and it matters not at all. It sort of all comes down to about the same thing. It actually turns out to work for reflective and formative constructs between them and across, but I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. This is just something we had to develop for that MIS quarterly paper. So here's what we developed. We basically said the Jingle and the Jangle fallacy really boils down to what we call the construct identity fallacy, where you have latent constructs that are either a pair of constructs here that are either the same or different, and either have the same name or different names. And you have the true negatives and the true positives here. If the construct name is the same for a pair that have measured the same latent construct, and different as well over here. And then you get the Jangle fallacy here, when construct names are different, when latent constructs are the same, for example. Here's a really overwhelming example of something we did for our paper, just showing how 3 of these algorithms did. So the cosine here, it turns out our algorithm worked the best in having really high accuracy, and you can sort of see at different similarity levels how we were still doing much better than the other algorithms. But that's not super important. Right now, we've actually found ways to improve on these numbers quite a bit, by a factor of 4 at least. So we're coming up with new ways to improve these measurements. And I won't go into much detail on it, but one of the things we actually had a bit of a brainstorm on, have you ever been in a really large library sub-basement with lots of empty tables? At some point, what we had to do to test our algorithms was we printed every construct with a name, a definition, and all its items on a sheet of paper, and the pile would be about this high, 4,000 or 5,000 constructs, and we would start sorting them on different tables in the room, and we'd run out of table space, and we'd start using the floor, and we'd have to move construct groups that were similar together and create another grouping level. We had flags of different colors. It was quite the little look we had going there. But we recently figured out that that may not be necessary, because the fact that someone publishes a paper that they say, these 4 items, according to our factor analysis, measure this thing. And we can actually use that as our training data, we realized. So we're actually doing quite well with that right now. This is an analysis I just ran today with very simple similarity algorithms, but with this idea that listen to what the authors say. This item is synonymous to this item, it's synonymous to this item, it's synonymous to that item, this and that, that and that, that and that. So now I have a bunch of rows that says these items are similar, and now I can train my algorithm with that. I give it a bunch of randomly selected pair of items that are not likely to be synonymous as well. So we think we're going to do much better than this, but this was just very, very simple analysis with that principle. This was an R-square of 0.5 compared to what we think is about 0.1 on the previous analysis I showed you. That was sort of one project, trying to organize all of these constructs. Project 2 is we're combining NLP and psychometrics to try and estimate theories without actually surveying people. What we've done here, the latest round here, we took on the technology acceptance model, the most popular theory in my field, and tried to use SAM, or structural equation modeling, to apply that to the language vectors for the items instead of the survey data. This is with Kjetil, my co-author. We're the ones who've been working the most on it, but we're focusing there on leadership surveys. And this is more on the IS side. And then here did an IS started this analysis of the enormous NIH promise instrument, which is actually working better than we expected. So this is a theory. This is technology acceptance model. Perceived ease of use drives perceived usefulness of a technology. Both of them drive my intention to use, which will again drive actual system use. And again, our belief is you can test this without respondents. If you just take the 6 items for this, the 6 items for this, and the 3 items for that, and you calculate their vectors in the semantic space.
What's the raw data then, exactly, that you feed it?
We have a 500-dimensional semantic space, so the raw data is each questionnaire item's vector in that space. So it's 500 numbers on a long string, if you like, or a vector.
And are those responses to the instrument?
No, it's just the language, the semantics of that question in a high-dimensional space, so that will pick up on, you might have one dimension that deals with love. You might have another dimension that deals with something else. We don't know what these vectors actually deal with. So in CVSEM, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but you have to set the number of respondents. So in this case, this is one weakness, I think, of this research. These tools are not developed for semantic vectors. So because we have no respondents, in this case, we set the number of respondents to 500, which is the number of dimensions we had. So here's our underlying logic of this and what we think we're picking up on. There is this underlying lexical closeness in English usage patterns, okay? English language usage patterns. And that predisposition biases how people write articles, for example, newspaper articles, as well as how they answer survey questions, okay? So you cannot actually fill out a survey without understanding the language of that survey, and you cannot write a newspaper article without understanding the language that you're writing it in, right? And that language actually has to lock into each other in some way. So what we're finding or believing here is that the empirical data correlations that we get after surveying people should have some overlap with the lexical closeness of analyzing newspaper articles. So we created 2 semantic spaces here, like what I showed you with the example. One was based on what we call the business corpus, is based on business newspaper articles. We collected about 84,000 articles that were mostly actually about leadership behaviors. And the news corpus, which was a much wider sampling of large large newspapers in the US rather. 162,000 articles, about 231,000 unique words or stems, if you want to call of words. And then we projected the survey items into each of these spaces to see how to imbue them, if you like, with this 500-dimensional vector, each of the questions. And then we pushed those vectors into CVSEM. And this is something we had to work really hard with convincing one of the reviewers that, guess what? Survey questions do not exist in newspaper articles, okay? So I thought that was pretty obvious, but we actually had to search for bits and pieces of the survey questions inside all of the articles that we had used. And we find things like, this is like the biggest overlap we could find. Customers were using the website, which using the website is one of the parts of one of the questions, to choose casket models, which they would then order over the phone. So this is about buying a casket before you die, or maybe for a loved one. So it's just the decomposed language, if you like, that's being used. For those of you who use CVSEM or a tool like this, here's a factor analysis of the all the items are 15 items. And you'll see here that we don't have a perfect factor analysis here. It's struggling a bit with some of the items. But when we drop the items that were actually dropped from this original study, so they did this exact same thing with empirical data and published it in 2003. When we dropped the items they dropped, we also got a perfect factor structure. Okay? So you get the correlations here and here you can actually see this was before we dropped the items, and this is what we get the factor pattern between these items after we rotate for the reduced set of items. And here are the CVSM item loadings. For those who care about that, you'll find that only one of the items did not actually behave the way we expected it to based on the empirical paper. Otherwise, it was all the same. For those of you who love your fit indices, all of our fit indices were within the norms for survey data analysis and structural equation models. And just to sort of jump right to the overall results of that paper, for the business corpus analysis, we had a significant model with intended use as a dependent variable with an R-square of 0.53. And we tried also with perceived usefulness as a dependent variable, 0.52. And these are actually incredibly close to what the original TAM paper that we tried to recreate actually got as well with real respondent data. One cool thing we did, we actually started our SEM analysis with each of these, with this one, and then we overlaid the original theory, empirical data, was able to show how much more the empirical data actually contained beyond the language. And we managed to show that the original data, and we had to do this to get it published, actual empirical data had some value. It was tiny, but it was statistically significant. And that was one of the things we had to do to satisfy the reviewers. The paper was originally rejected from the top journal in our field. And this is one of the things we said there. Going in there, we were rather naive about what we could say and what we could not get away with saying. We really went out swinging. And of course, it was rejected. Then in the second journal, we sent it to, this is not brought as a technique of TAN, but as praise to the quality of its methodology. Okay, that worked. So, but again, that's a problem, right? You send in a paper about a given theory. Who are they going to pick as reviewers for your paper? They're going to pick people who have made their living off of that theory. So that's one of our educational things here. This is literally the second to the last slide. You have been very patient with me, and I appreciate that. I do try in anything I create to create design artifacts from them so other people can go in and test this for themselves with their own data. One of the things that I'm in charge of is this theories used in IS Research Wiki. That's sort of neither here nor there, but it's an incredibly popular resource, about 400,000 page loads a year. Here's another one we created based on this, what we call our internomological network, which is at inn.theorizeit.org, where you can search for the constructs that we collected, about 70 to 80,000 constructs and their items and definitions. Here's a newer version of this at theorion.org, where we're actually letting you, in addition to search for the constructs, we have actually visualized the network of constructs in the paper, so we do that automatically by pulling apart the hypothesis and finding what constructs are in the paper and what relationships they have. And then you can actually put them constructs from different papers together while we're observing you, hopefully to get some gold standard data or training data for our algorithms. Here's the theory network thing where we're tracking individual theories and seeing as a new paper is published, we pull that paper down we run a machine learning model on it to find out, did this paper contribute to the theory or not, or was it just a drive-by citation or something like that. We are creating this construct identity detector software, and this is what it's going to look like, where you can then upload your short text, your questions, and run a bunch of different algorithms on it so you can run your own analysis of your surveys. And before I get to the last slide, this is the fastest I've ever gone through stuff that took me 10 years to wrap my head around.
So we're 9 years and 364 days behind you.
Well, or that much faster than me if you understood any of this.
Yeah.
So any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I can't say whether I understood any of it, but I do have a question. On project 1, you mentioned that you were basically using measures to train your ML model. So can you explain a little more why the way that I was understanding it was that you were using those measures to train the model in terms of like a structural training? You're not using it to train them with the actual synonymous terms. You're using it so that your model can discover synonymous terms on its own. Is that correct? Okay. Which makes it non-problematic because it's just looking for structure.
Yes, it's looking for, if you like, kind of those, what's in each of these dimensions. For example, the 500 dimensions. If you stack all pairs of items, so for example, one analysis we're in the process of doing right now, the one I showed you the graphics for that I did this morning, we took 4,500 items from my field. We multiplied them against each other, n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So every pair got its own rows. So that's what 4,000 by 4,000, I forget how many rows that is, but 8 million rows plus. And then for every row that has 2 items in it, right? The text of 2 items. Or you expand that out and it becomes 500 dimensional vectors for 2 items. And then you have a target. Did they come from the same construct or not? So that gives us about 50,000 pairs of synonymous items. And then we randomly sample about another 50 to 100,000 pairs that are not from the same construct. And the problem there that you might pick up on is the fact that if one paper published a paper, one paper had the construct self-efficacy of running in it, and another paper has self-efficacy of running in it, we're going to tag all item pairs between those as non-synonymous, right? But that is so unusual that when you downsample from 8 million pairs down to 50 or 100,000, the vast majority of those are gone. And then you can basically be pretty certain that the set of zeros that you have, those are from that in your training data set are not measuring the same thing you think, has no more than a 1% failure rate or so. Okay? And then you can run your model through and find the ones that you actually made that mistake with, and then clean up your data if you like. Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out as a political scientist what you can tell us here, and I guess whether or not you're going to put us out of business. So as someone who's interested in what the public thinks, it sounds to me like what you can tell us is if I put together a number of survey questions, you can tell me that people who answered yes to this item are likely to answer no to this item. And so you can tell me those. But you can't tell me that, for example, there has been an increase in support for gun control or some change like that.
I cannot. There has to be an underlying general sense, for example, of Myron's leadership.
Or lack thereof.
That your survey is going to get at, right? But what I think we're finding is that that underlying positive or negative feeling is much more diffused in our brain than our constructs actually suggest. So once you push up on, let's say you're surveying someone who's very positive about Myron, you're going to get a very easy way to find how they're going to answer, question 2, question 3, and so on, once you, in question 1, find out his general level. So we actually moved this, I didn't talk about this, but in our latest research, let's say all of you guys were surveyed, we're actually trying to find your semantic dependency at the individual respondent level. And that actually is where we see going.
Semantic dependency, define that.
How much can we predict your answers based on the similarity of questions in the survey? So if your matrix of answers is like the matrix of answers that we expect based on semantics between the questions, then we think you're semantically dependable.
But is that a bit misleading? It could just be that they're measuring the same latent construct. Maybe I'm getting caught up in the semantics, but when you say semantically dependent, it suggests that it's just the words that's swaying my answer. But in fact, they're correlated because I think Myron's a great leader, and you asked me 2 different questions about that, and so I said answer the same way to both. So
Yeah.
why is that semantically dependent?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it yet because we don't have the right data yet to test that hypothesis. But I do think that we split people into 2 groups. One that we call semantically dependable, but I think you're right, there's going to be a group there that just answer because that's what they truly believe.
Mm-hmm.
The semantic structures of the data or your survey happens to be exactly what they believe. Right? But then I think there's going to be another part of that group that may just be answering that way because they're reading the language of the survey in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's going to be the group that's not semantically dependable, which we think might actually be giving us more useful data. Okay? Those are the people who are answering quite opposite to what you'd expect. Now, is it possible that means that those people are the ones that aren't paying attention to your survey? Yes, so even that group I think is going to split into 2 groups, the useful group and the group that's not paying attention. So we're looking into whether actually my initial starting point for all of this research when I got the ID in 2006, my initial belief was that I could use a dual process theory on this. That is, there are 2 kinds of people filling out surveys. The ones that shallowly processing it, and the ones that are deeply processing it. And the shallow ones are the ones we can predict, we think, at least to a certain extent.
Okay.
So if we can put people into a shallow processor of survey and a deep processor of survey group, we might be able to predict better the actual following behavior of those 2 groups. But I'm just guessing there, because we've never gotten access to that kind of data yet.
As kind of a follow-up to that idea, are there ways from this research that you could design surveys better to drop people into the deeper processing? Like, are there red flags that for questions or items that are less challenging, or that follow the rules better? Like, are there better ways to make sure that we're getting real opinions and less just triggering people's semantic responses?
I hope so.
Great. Me too.
My honest hope for all of this research is that we can move past the, oh my God, you guys have been wasting your time thing. Because I don't think that's what this is about at all. Initially it is, okay, we built all these theories without a single respondent. However, what if we can build this stuff into your survey process and do much better at actually predicting whether people are going to show up to vote or not based on their survey? Whether, the different surveys that measure how satisfied people are with their president, for example, which you all use slightly different language, right? Can we actually figure out which of those surveys are using language in a way that will guarantee a good result for that president versus the one that doesn't? So these are all things that I haven't, simply put, I am a very lowly funded person, and I don't have a whole lot of resources, so I work on the projects that I think are really exciting and will get me my rewards at the college, but they're not the most influential projects necessarily. But there, and then it's
Yeah, I have a long question, so.
Okay.
I have a
Others
short
should go
question. I don't know if there'd be any utility in it. Is it interesting to you at all to think about getting word embeddings from like training a words-to-vec model instead? Just, I don't know, to compare what
Yeah,
happens.
that's actually the next step on the project that I laid out right here somewhere earlier. I laid out these beautiful green and red, this one. This is actually based on just cosines of word counts, that initial matrix that I told you about. The next thing we're working on right now, I'm actually working with 2 undergraduates who have taken my business analytics class, and we're doing a deep learning neural networks in Python class, independent study. And they're actually right now using, pulling down the glove vectors to be able to do that. We'll probably try out word2vec as well, but I'm trying not to overwhelm them this early in the semester. But yeah, that's exactly what we're thinking about. Maybe we can do here. Myron,
So you
I'm gonna hide behind here.
talking, I wonder if you wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of bigger ideas about how you might link this to the content of social science publications.
well, I see this as social. So I'll say something that you're going to react negatively to. This is what I believe about any paper that you guys have written the last few years. Someone else had the idea before you. Someone else tested almost exactly that model before you. And you just couldn't find them in your lit review. And in fact, you're incentivized not to find them. Our research indicates that you're finding about 1% or less of the relevant articles when you do a lit review. So think about that for a second. The goal, I think, in terms of what I'm hoping to do with Myron, is to take all of these articles that have been published, feed them into algorithms that will break them up into all their constituent pieces, hypotheses, as I mentioned, the constructs inside those hypotheses, the relationships between those constructs, the statistical relationships between the constructs, and so on and so forth. Once we pull all of that out, and you probably notice this when you search for a construct in Google Scholar. Have you ever done that? Your favorite construct, like self-efficacy? What happens? How many answers, how many responses do you get? Millions, right? And it doesn't matter. So my typical example is usefulness. The most useful construct in my field gets me 3 to 4 million papers on Google Scholar, because Google Scholar cannot distinguish between the construct usefulness and my random use of the word useful or usefulness in my article. So by pulling these apart, we can actually create search engines that will work, that will immediately visualize the theoretical network that you care about, and potentially even take this next step, which is what we're trying to do here with that much smaller data set we manually pulled out. Can we create Cronbach and Meehl's nomological network? This mythologized thing that we're supposedly all out to create together, of how all these constructs are related to each other, can we calculate it with algorithms? And I think the answer is a little bit of it at least. Probably not Did that answer your question at all?
A little bit, yeah. So, I mean, it's a pretty big, I think that the most of us would want to redefine the first part of your question, your first part of your response, by saying that in most of our fields, we're not finding 1%, we're probably finding 60 or 70%, because we know the field over time. If you do a random search, maybe you'll find 1%. In most of our fields, because we teach it and know it, we find a big fraction of it. There's not much of it that's out there being published in Russia that we have no clue is there. Maybe that's true in medicine, it's not true in social science. And I think the question, so the question then becomes, could we have a test to find out, how you would design a test to find out if having this improved access to concepts within the literature and answers would actually improve science. Those are kind of two big things that would really make a difference in terms of understanding from your more theoretical work, how to get to something where you could say, gee, if we just invested $5 million in this, we would reduce everybody's work time on a project by 10%, which might be a really big investment, might be a really big improvement.
Myron, I will tell you this, what my academic goal is for my life. It is to improve the speed with which you do your research and the way in which you select your questions better by somewhere between 1% and 3%. If I can do that for everyone, and you multiply that up by the number of researchers in the social and behavioral sciences, I may never get any credit for any of it, but I will have made a much bigger difference than if I kept developing these models on my own. But I will tell you this, it depends on the theory you're looking at, right? So we actually did this experiment for the MIS quarterly paper in 2016. We created a small database of about 500 papers that we knew every single construct inside of it, and we gave 32 PhD students access to, half of them got to use our system, that was only the constructs that had been extracted, and half of them used, what is it called again? One of the commercial search engines, I forget what they used. And it improved their ability to find stuff by about a factor of 4 in some cases, especially for unknown constructs. For the theory, so keep in mind, that's 500-600 papers, and we found that they were able to find 10% of the construct papers they should have found.
Oh,
10%. The theory that we asked them to find papers on has about 40,000 citations now. We did a random sample of those papers and found that 27% of 600 randomly selected papers were actually contributing to that theory. So that means about 10,000 contributions to the technology acceptance model. By the way, the technology acceptance model is almost identical to TRA, TPD. It is, there are about 5 or 8 other theories just like it. And we did not count those against the people who were doing this. Yeah.
So Curry, that was really my question. Going back, before you're worrying about the individual surveys, to this ability to examine what's seemingly different. For me, it goes back to the fact that regression analysis and analysis of variance were for so many years in statistics thought to be something different from one another. So the issue for me is you've set out to look at certain sets of theories. How are you carrying that work forward? Because that seems to me to be a fascinating aspect, that your first step seems to me to be something that's truly fascinating as well.
Okay. Could you say more? Because I had a response to that, but it would just be me repeating myself. So tell me more.
Well, I really think about research that you have chosen certain theoretical constructs
Right,
to then examine
yeah,
how similar or different
yeah.
they are. And would it be useful in the social and behavioral sciences to pursue further that kind of questioning of theories?
Right. Yeah, that's my thorough belief, that if we could just find out how to make this useful somehow in terms of your survey behaviors and your theory testing behaviors, I'm hopeful we can get to the point where people would actually see this as a step forward, and they could actually redo a number of the analyses they've already done. Right? So now you have all these data sets that you've been sitting on, and I understand in some of your fields you have to share data. But in most of the fields I deal with, when people realize that if you give out an item correlation matrix, they can actually check whether you did your job right. At the moment people realize that, what happened? Well, no one published item correlation matrices anymore. So our problem is actually access to data more than anything else. So I have to add people to the papers I write on this to get access to their data, at least in my field. But yeah, thank you.
Jim, did you have one last one?
Well, I guess I was just wondering how much of this is language versus the concepts. As I'm thinking about your matrices and how you're representing it, could it just be the language that you're capturing instead of the concepts? Because if it were concepts, it would be invariant to the language. If you had a non-native speaker or went to the 1940s or something like that, then you should be able to still pick up the concept because the language constructs would be different in the 40s than they are now. Have you looked at what, what it is that you're measuring that way?
I think I'm gonna punt that one and say no, but we are in the middle of a larger project testing this out across different languages. So we're doing Chinese respondents in Chinese respondents in English, Norwegian respondents in Norwegian and English, Pakistani respondents in Urdu and English, and so on, to try and figure out what does this mean for cultural research. And I am not willing to make the extravagant claims that Michael Alpha wants to make about that, but it's not super supportive of cultural research, what we're finding so far. I think that's my cue for last slide. I didn't get all the way back to the last one, so let's, there we go. This is going to be my view this summer when I go to Norway for 3 weeks and work on my book.
Yeah.
But these are the things I'm hoping to work on. I am always looking for collaborators for the Project One kind of stuff that I mentioned. We actually have all these constructs for a number of disciplines that we haven't actually been able to analyze yet, like sociology, psychology, and so on. And for the Project Two, also looking for collaborators, and we need survey data linked to later behavior so we can see whether, what this all means, essentially. And verified voter data might be one such thing when you survey people about whether they're likely to vote or not. Can we actually figure out whether you're likely to vote or not afterwards if we have verified voter data on that? So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much.